station where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.
Right, hello everyone. Thank you very much. It's good to see a big crowd here actually. Right, I've just put my laptop there, it's just for my notes, because normally I print my notes off and I couldn't find my notes, so I've bought my laptop instead. I gathered from what Andy was saying, a lot of you have had sort of your own kind of personal experiences with something strange, even if you can't always categorise it, a ghost or a spirit or even a fairy. Who's seen a fairy? Anyone seen a fairy? Lady here at the front? Couple. I feel like I'm bidding. I'll take two. Who's seen a ghost? Quite a few people. Who thinks they've seen a spirit? Right, interesting, because there's a lot of confusion about ghosts and spirits and possibly even fairies. So I'll try and cover them tonight if I can. And I'm not going to try and prove their existence. It's really up for you to go away and just chew it over and make up your own minds. And obviously the best kind of proof is personal experience for most people. And you know, I don't really care about the skeptics really. The thing about what skeptics always ask, they always ask for evidence. They want photographs, they want sound recordings, they want measurements and things like that. And when you encounter these things, you're not actually got all those tools of the trade with you to record them, and you're not expecting it. And one of the things that a guy that's talking about UFOs said, that people said, well, where's this UFO photograph? The thing is, you're so dumbfounded by what you've seen or experienced, you're just hypnotised by the event. You can't actually pick up a camera or go for that recorder and things like that. And so when skeptics come in and sort of accuse you of all this fakery and things like that, well, that's the kind of excuse that we have to give. It's not the best excuse, but that's the situation we find ourselves in. Anyway, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, as Anne explained. I'm Neil Geddes-Ward. I'm born in 1964. I'm one of 5 boys. My dad was a technical illustrator. I was born in the middle. I'm the only one that ever took up artwork on any kind of serious level, and you can see some of that here at the front if you want to take a peek at the end. I'm the only person ever to get my money back from odour eaters, but that's another story entirely. I'm not going to provide proof of that. But about 12 years ago, I was involved in the writing of a book called Faerycraft, because the lady I was married to, Neil Geddes-Ward, she was very much into fairies and things like that, and I ended up doing this book with her. Obviously I was the illustrator and she was the author, and I had a long interest in fairies even before I met her. I mean, I actually remember going through some old sketchbooks from when I was at school and found, actually to my surprise, I completely forgot about this, I'd actually drawn a fairy myself back in 1978 in a sesame seed bun. But that's the kind of humour I've got, you see, unfortunately. You've been exposed to some of that tonight. So anyway, but back in about 2004, we got this commission to do this book called Faerycraft, and the book was basically about the blending of witchcraft and magic with fairies, and Alison had that kind of pagan witchcrafty background to kind of write all about that thing, and I did the illustrations, as I said. But so we went into a lot of research to try and find out about fairies and the encounters that people have had, and we came to sort of conclusions, or not conclusive conclusions, because other people might have their own ideas, but the things that we found is that fairies tend to come in about 4 different types, and they're often referred to as the elementals. We found that there's water-based type of fairies, and they're like would hang around by rivers and streams and lakes and things. And someone even suggested that the Loch Ness Monster, if it actually exists, could be a fairy of a sort, although I wouldn't imagine a huge kind of brontosaurus with tutu and wings coming to land over Loch Ness, but I'd love to see the pictures if you could present it to me. But that's one kind of thing of potentially what a water fairy could be. Then you've got the gnomes of the earth. They're called the earth-based fairies. And again, they haven't got wings as people tend to think of them, but they'd be associated with the elements of the earth and the minerals of the earth, and perhaps even the precious metals of the earth. And this is why you get these things like tin fairies, and they're associated with Cornish mines and things. They're often found in mines, and lots of miners have reported seeing strange sightings when they're actually mining things in the earth. And then you've got the elementals of the air, and they tend to be what most people would think of Tinkerbell, with a tutu and a wand, and they're associated with the air. And I'm not saying that fairies necessarily have to have wings, okay? That's a very Disneyfied or Victorian kind of thing. It's a bit like people always put wings on angels. And I don't necessarily think that angels would have wings. I'm pretty sure fairies perhaps don't, although I have to admit some guilt there that I have drawn fairies with wings for the book. But most people expect to see fairies like that these days. So when you're trying to convey an idea, you tend to draw it with wings, and people go, oh yeah, it's a fairy, okay? But I'm not saying they always have wings. It's just the way that we kind of perceive them. And if people have seen fairies with wings, it could be that they do, or maybe it's just our mind tending to shape what we're seeing a little bit because of our preconceived ideas. Okay, and then we've got the fairies of covered the air, fire. Oh yeah, we've got ones of the fire fairies. And people associate that with the element of fire and that kind of heat energy. And some people even reported seeing fairies associated with electricity. And Alison herself said that she saw an elemental being right near a pylon. It was kind of a blue, kind of sparking, electrical kind of energy moving towards her. So it's very interesting. And, it's not always what you imagine these things to be. Right, so moving on from what they possibly could be categorised at, I'll talk about some encounters that people have had. Part of the research that we did, we actually looked into old books and films and things like that. And one of the films that we came across, and you can actually find this on YouTube today, but I think you can order it off Amazon, it was a film by a Canadian filmmaker called John Walker. And he had gone around Canada, North America, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, places like that, and actually filmed people and interviewed people and asked them about their own fairy encounters and what they believed and what they experienced. And it had some very, very amazing stories in that film, so I certainly recommend it if you're ever curious and want to find out more. One of the stories that comes to mind was the story about this lady in Canada. I think it was in the mid-70s. She'd taken her young children to have a paddle by this lake and have an afternoon's picnic by this lake in Canada. And as she was there, she could hear this strange, weird music coming from somewhere, but she couldn't pinpoint the origin of where this music was coming from. But she didn't like the sense of what she felt. She felt that something bad was about to happen. And so she was holding the hands of her children as they were paddling in the lake, and still she could hear this strange music. And she thought, I've got to get out of here. So she grabbed her children and scurried away from the lakeshore, trying to get her children back into the car. And the children, of course, wanted to stay in the lake paddling. They said, why have we got to go? And she says, get in the car, shouting at them. Now, what they did in the film, they took this lady back to the location where she experienced it many, many years later. And the young daughter that she was with back in 1974 was obviously a grown woman by this time. And so, of course, she was there for the filming. And she said, I remember paddling in the lake as a child with my mum. And I remember her shouting us to all get in the car. And she goes, I too heard the music. She goes, but I also remember my mum shouting, don't look out the window. And she goes, but as a child, I was so curious, I just had to look out the window. She goes, she peered over the back window, and where the car was driving away, she could see this troop of beings coming down this pathway. And she said, they all appeared to be holding hands, and they were very small, about that big, and they seemed to be singing and dancing, and it was possibly the origin of this strange music. And so they were kind of glad to get out of there. And there's this kind of legend that associates it. If you hang around fairies and they're doing this weird music, that strange things can happen to you. So I think that woman was kind of sensible to get away, because there's a belief that fairies are all twee and nice, and I don't think that's always the case, which I'll tell you a bit more about as we go on. Again, music plays another part to the next story, again featured in the film. This time, John Walker went to Ireland, and he filmed this Scottish builder who's from Glasgow, and he'd gone to Ireland for a holiday, and he was walking around Southern Ireland, and again he heard this strange, weird music, couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. But he decided to sit down because it just rained and he wanted to take in the view of the valley. The sun was unfolding, the clouds were parting, and a lovely rainbow was forming over the valley. He thought, what a lovely scene that is. And he was just mesmerised by this beautiful scene unfolding of the landscape of Ireland. But all the time, he was disturbed by something that was down, moving around his peripheral vision, something round by his feet. But he thought, no, I'm going to carry on looking at the scene unfolding before me. But still there was this annoying movement down by his feet, and he couldn't work out what it was. So he thought, okay, I'm going to have to take my eyes off the scene and look down to see what it is. And he looked down, and by his feet, he saw a small woman, about a foot high, brown leathery kind of texture to her skin, a brown kind of hat, he said, and she had what appeared to be old-style sheep shears, the sort of things that old farmers might have used to cut the sheep in times gone by. And this is where it gets really weird, so you want to strap in for this one. Throw your Stephen Hawking's books away, because they'll make no sense to this one. This lady, or being, was cutting round the sole of his shoe, like that. And he said where his shadow extended in the afternoon sun, there was a male being as well at the end of his shadow. And this is where it gets really freaky. The male being was rolling up his shadow by paper. Okay? So this is where it completely defies physics as we understand it. I mean, if a physicist said, oh, that can't possibly happen, we'll say, yeah, those beings shouldn't be there by your physics. But they were doing, I mean, you couldn't make that one up, could you? I mean, you know, this was a builder, a very down-to-earth guy, and he was telling this wondrous story about a being rolling up his shadow. And of course, he was shocked. He thought, what do I do? He said, I was expecting to see these creatures there, and he couldn't think of anything to say apart from saying, oi, like that, as you would to anyone, like, oi, get away. And he said they looked at each other as if to sort of be surprised, oh my God, he can see us. And he said they went, psh, and just vanished. And he said, I dread to think what would happen to me had I not seen them. What would happen if they carried on cutting around the sole of his shoe and this other male equivalent being carried on rolling out his shadow and they waltzed off with his shadow? I mean, what does it mean? Why would they take his shadow? And I actually wonder, maybe that perhaps they were taking the sense of energy from him in some sense, but in a kind of symbolic sense, it looked like a shadow. I mean, a shadow, we understand it's if you hold your hand out and there's a shadow there, but you can't physically take it off the wall. So he was seeing something, and I wonder if the legends of vampires, where they're supposedly taking the blood from us, maybe they're intertwined with other kind of stories, and it could be the fact that it could be a misinterpretation of events, and maybe these beings, fairies, or whatever they're coming in the form of, are removing something from us. And this guy interpreted it as shadows. I'll take questions at the end if I may. So I wonder, that maybe they're taking energy, and maybe they're taking a part of his soul or something. But it's only a pondering of ideas. But it's a very interesting story. It certainly unnerved me. Now, yeah, okay. Right, yeah, now I was on a plane about 12 years ago, and I was flying back to Spain. There's lots of people flying back to Spain. I was flying to Spain for a holiday. And my son was with me next to me on the plane, and my ex-wife was with me with my daughter behind me. And the last seat on the plane was taken up by this gentleman who was dark-skinned, and I thought he was Spanish, but it turned out in our chat that he was from Iran. He said, I prefer to call it Persia, but you would know it as Iran today. So he said, I said, oh, why are you going to Spain then, a holiday? He goes, no, I'm an architect and I'm going back there just to check on the buildings that I've been designing, making sure they're going the right way around and that kind of thing. And, I'll take a bit of a holiday as well. He said, what are you going there for? I said, well, we're going for a holiday. He says, and what do you do? And I said, well, I'm an artist, but I run this thing called a fairy museum. And of course, that's a fairy museum. And at the time, I lived in the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. And we had this art gallery full of the artwork that I've got here. And we called it a fairy museum because obviously we were writing the book about fairy craft and lots of fairy stories associated with the Orkney Islands. And so I showed him lots of pictures of the drawings that I'd done and kind of explained the ideas behind them. So, as I said, I mentioned that film about this guy's shadow being cut away, and I told him that story. I said, what do you think to that? He goes, oh yeah, it's very strange. He said, we don't really understand. Science hasn't really got a handle on everything at the moment. We've only got our hands on the door handle of this new reality, and we haven't really opened it up fully yet. He said, I'll tell you something. And I don't think, had I not mentioned this, he wouldn't have opened up to me. He said, basically, he said that when he was a young guy back in Iran, or Persia, as he preferred to call it, I would say he's probably about 19 or 20, he was patrolling the streets with an army friend. And it was their job to patrol streets on a night shift sort of thing. And they were walking around. He said a sandstorm blew up, which is common in those parts. He said to his buddy, let's go and seek shelter in this mosque. So they went into this mosque and they took their shoes off, as is the custom. And they found a wall. And he said to his friend, you sit down and go to sleep, and I'll sit by the side of you. And after an hour, I'll wake you up, and then I'll have a sleep. And then you look after me, sort of thing. So that was their arrangement. So his friend went to sleep, and this guy, I'll call him Hussein. He didn't really want me to reveal his real name, which was Saddam. But unfortunately, he kept falling asleep as well. He said no matter how hard he tried, he can't stay awake. He just kept nodding off. And he thought, oh, I must stay awake, I must stay awake. So after the third time, he woke up again, after the third time, thinking, I must stay awake. And at this point, he noticed there was other people in the room with him. There was a lady watching him, but she was down by his feet, and she was looking at his feet. And next to this lady that was crouching down, looking at Hussein's feet, was a child about 12 years of age, looking at his friend's feet. And they were just staring at the feet like this, looking at them. And he thought, where the hell have these people come from? So he thought, I don't want to alert them to the fact that I can see them. I'll try and wake up my friend. So he said he tried to press on the chest of his friend with his elbow. He said no matter how hard he pressed on his friend's chest, his friend was still asleep. So Hussein said, because I had the gun, I was going to make a run for it. I don't know why. He's the guy with the gun, but he was going to make a run for it. He started to wrapped the strap of the gun around his arm, very slowly and carefully and quietly as possible. Unfortunately, this being or woman looked at him, looked up from the feet and looked at him in the eyes, and he said, as soon as I made eye contact with this woman, I knew that she wasn't from this world. So it just clicked, and that eye contact said it all. He said at that point, the woman stood up, and the young girl stood up as well. He said they turned and walked away, and as they walked away, he said he noticed they had cloven hoofed feet. And then they vanished into the wall of the mosque. And when he told me that, a shiver went up on my spine, I can tell you. I wanted to fly back to England after that. And I thought about it, oh my God, that's an amazing story. And I kind of thought, hang on a minute, there's some substance to this, because there's legends that you hear of these people like Pan with cloven hoofed feet, and then you've got the typical idea of the devil with cloven hoofed feet and things like that, and centaurs and stuff like that, which I'll come to in a minute. I thought, well, maybe if they're not legends or made up stories, maybe there's some substance and that we do encounter these beings. And I thought it was a very interesting thing that it happened in a mosque where people are praying on a regular basis, and people talk about prayer energy and building up psychic energy and things like that. And I wondered if maybe that could be something to do with it. They built up like a portal, and these creatures or beings, whatever you want to call them, are coming in. Now also, the point is that they were staring at their human feet, because I think from their point of view, they was just as curious about the human feet, and that to them, the human feet were as a bit of an oddity to them. Whereas to them, their cloven hoof feet were the normal way of doing things, the normal way of walking about or whatever. And I wonder, again with fairies, what are fairies? Are they spirits or whatever? And I wonder if they're like a branch of humanity, in the same way that we've got, say, humans in the world, and we've got different races of humans around the world, Aborigines, Africans, and white people, and Eskimos, and all that sort of stuff. And then you branch out into the weird stuff like the hominoids, which are talking about, let's say, like the Sasquatch or the Bigfoot. I wonder if they're all kind of connected, but also these other things around us are also part of that family, but not just a physical sense, but they're in a world that we can't quite perceive all the time. And they're in a frequency or two off from our reality, or off from our level of perception, okay? So, yeah, I think that what he was seeing was perhaps the origins of old legends like Pan, okay? And he was just an ordinary guy, and it's interesting that, these aren't pot-smoking hippies I was talking to, they're ordinary people with some extraordinary experiences, and he wasn't likely to tell everyone about it. He just kind of kept it quietly to himself, but he only opened up to me because I opened up to him. Okay? Right, let's just go down a little bit further here. Okay, so we'll leave fairies behind for a minute. I'll just tell you this story about, I mentioned centaurs earlier. A lot of people obviously, and I'm sure you've got stories as well, come up to me at the end of doing a talk like this, and they tell me their own personal stories. And again, it's not ones they're going to likely share with the public or the family. But there was this lady that came up to me last October, and unfortunately she had lost her baby. It was a stillbirth, and she said that where the hospital was, they'd got this special kind of, I don't know what they call it, a room where you go with the baby, the dead body of the baby, and they put it in a cot, and you can just sit there and try and come to terms with it as best as you can, a mourning room or whatever like that. So she sat there on this bed with her baby dead in the cot, and she was just crying and trying to sort of thinking, I've got to be strong for my family. And she was looking down at the floor, and she said a few seconds later, into the room came about 5 or 6 small beings, and she said they were centaurs, literally people's bodies with horse bodies at the back. And she said they weren't pretty at all, they were very, very ugly. A bit like the woman I mentioned earlier with the scissors, she was ugly. I don't think these fairies are very pretty, they're not going to be on the catwalk. But they all came in, and a lot of them started to look into the cot at the baby that was dead, and 2 of them looked at her in the face. And they just stared at her. And I said, well, did they say anything? She goes, no, they just stared at me. And they was just staring at the dead baby in the cot. I said, well, what happened then? She goes, well, I don't really remember. They just kind of then just went away, but I don't know how long the time was, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And she said, I don't even remember counting how many there were. I was just like in that moment. It was almost like she was semi-tranced out or something with this experience. Some people call that the Oz factor, and it happens with UFOs as well. You're kind of in this weird kind of state of perception. So yeah, I'll just touch upon that. Again, not ghosts or spirits as we understand them, but fairies are kind of completely different kettle of fish. I think ghosts and spirits are more to do with humans rather than the fairy realm, and I'll get on to ghosts. So we talked about that some of you have seen ghosts, some of you have seen spirits. My own classification of what I think they are is that I believe ghosts are more possibly recordings on the atmosphere, because sometimes you see in it, people talk about grey ladies and things like that, and they haunt the room, or they come in and do a regular routine and they go away again. A typical example, I remember, as I mentioned, I lived in the Orkney Islands, and a chap who lived up there thought that he lived in one of the oldest buildings of Orkney. He thought it was something connected with a monastery. He said that down the hallway from his kitchen, he would regularly see a monk sitting in his hallway on a stool, and he appeared to be chatting to someone, but you couldn't see the other person he was chatting to. We also saw the light of what was a natural fireplace at that time flickering and shining on his face. So he said that this would happen regularly. He'd see the same scene enacted. And I wonder, and I've heard this from other researchers, that they talk about the fact that there could be like impressions recorded into the atmospheres of houses, in the same way that we all might record a program of our TV shows or whatever, that you can record unconsciously something of human experience into the walls of a place or into the environment in some way. I mean, Rupert Sheldrake, has anyone heard of Rupert Sheldrake? Like, you have. It's no surprise that many, many years ago he came up with this idea that water has memory, and again, you may be aware of that, but I think it was coming from the hypothesis of when you take, I can't think what it is, when you take those tablets and they're kind of minute and... homeopathy, that's it, I've lost words there. Yeah, he had the idea that if you kept diluting and diluting and diluting and diluting, you'd have none of that trace of the original medicine, whatever it was, in that, and it was just pure water, and he was proposing the idea that you could just take water and make you better, but he wondered if somehow if the water had a memory of the past experience it had got. And I wonder if that kind of extends perhaps into the environment, and remember there's moisture in walls, of course, that perhaps we're recording human experiences and they're getting replayed to us in some way. And maybe our own part of our minds has to be there to engage the video recorder, to press play, so to speak, that then we start to perceive these things. And only certain people, maybe with a psychic sensitivity, have that ability to press play, and they don't obviously know how they're pressing play, but that's what appears to be happening. Now, spirits, I think, are what I call more interactive, okay? So they're more PowerPoint presentations, and they'll kind of engage with you in certain ways. And I would suggest that they're perhaps more people that have died, and their existence has carried on in some way or form. And the normal order of things appears to be that they would go on to another plane of reality, another existence, another level. But sometimes they might hang around here, either by design or accident, and they just can't get onto that other level. And I think it depends on your attitude of mind and your own belief systems, that sometimes it can anchor you here and hold you here, especially if you're materially minded, or you don't believe in this kind of thing, that you can sometimes hold yourself to this plane of reality and you can't get up there or wherever you have to go. And other times you can, just depending on your own kind of thought processes, okay? And so spirits, they tend to be more interactive, and they will come into our world, or they just can't leave our world, for want of a better description. Yeah, I mean, an example of that was a number of years ago, I knew this lady who was a fellow artist, and we did exhibitions together, and she told me about a holiday they had in Cornwall with her husband, who was from Aberdeen. And they went to this holiday cottage, and it was one of these really, really old cottages out on the moor somewhere. Probably a wondrous place to be, but it sounds really scary from what she described to me. She said that they kept hearing all these knocks and rappings and things in this cottage, and so she went off to go and investigate where it's possibly coming from, and Adam, the husband, kept seeing the lights flickering downstairs in the living room, so he went off into the living room, and Deborah, the lady, went down into the kitchen, and she said that she went into the kitchen, and there was this girl in the kitchen, and she said, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And this girl turned round, and she had appeared to have like a great big slice through her head, but blue light was shining out of it, like beams of blue light, and it almost looked like she'd had an injury, and this effect was somehow now showing as just like a massive, great big blue light shining out of it. And this girl spoke to her, and she said, "What are you doing here?" And she goes, "I want chocolate." And that's what this girl kept saying, "I want chocolate." That's all she wanted. And I can't remember how it ended, but she says, "Go away," or something like that. But then Deborah said she had a mental impression that this girl had died by falling down the stairs in the cellar, or was possibly pushed. and this is where the injury had occurred, and this is possibly how she had died. And then Adam, meanwhile, was in the living room, and he had sighted 3, and I don't know what the type of soldiers you describe that, but if you think that program Sharp, where you got the Crimean type soldiers, he appeared to describe that from that kind of era. And they were in the living room, 3 of them were in the living room, and they had frost on their faces, where he believes they had died out in the moors of maybe hypothermia. And they appeared to be somehow controlling the electric, because they were fascinated, he thought, with the technology of electricity, because in their times they'd never got it. And they were somehow still anchored to this reality for whatever reason. But perhaps from their point of view, it might have only been minutes, because time is a different thing over there from what I understand. So that's a very scary place, and I wouldn't recommend going to that particular cottage for holidays. So you won't see it in any kind of holiday magazines. Now, has anyone sort of heard of spirit guides and things like that? Okay, right. So some of you will understand this, and I'll just explain to the ones that don't about what spirit guides are. I'll go right back to about now 25 years ago. I was doing tarot card readings, kind of feeling my way through this whole thing that we're all kind of doing, I guess. And I had people usually come around my house, and I'd do a tarot card reading for them. On one particular occasion, this lady rang up, and she says, "Oh, I understand you do tarot card readings. Can you come to my house?" And I said, "It's not the sort of normal thing I do, but okay, I'll come to your house and I'll do this reading." And she didn't live too far away, so it wasn't a million miles to travel. So I went to her house, and she lived in this little bungalow, and I did this reading, took about half an hour to an hour, something like that. And she goes, "Oh, that's very accurate." She goes, "But there's one thing you haven't told me." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And she says, "We haven't mentioned my husband." And I said, "Has your husband passed on?" And she said, "Yes, he has." I said, "Well, look, I've got to be honest with you. If I felt your husband around, I would have mentioned him to you." She goes, "Well, it's very interesting. Let me tell you this." She goes, "In this bedroom," and she took me around the house and she showed me the bedroom. And she goes, "In this bedroom, my husband spent the last year of his life, and he was seriously ill in bed for a whole year. He was so ill that he just couldn't get out of bed." And so she goes, every day she used to try and make him comfortable, lift him up, puff his pillows up, and make him a cup of tea, that kind of thing. And she goes, well, one day she was doing that kind of routine, lifting him up, puffing the pillows, and he said, "I feel so ill, I just want to die, I just want to die," he kept saying. And he said, with that, he went, "Ugh," and literally just died in her arms. And she laid him down, and she said, "I saw this vaporous mist come out of his chest." Because it went up towards the ceiling, went right across the corner of the room, and she pointed out the airing cupboard in the corner of the room. And she goes, it went into there. And then she said, "And I told my doctor this, and he just laughed at me." And she goes, "I know that you won't laugh at me." She said, "But 6 months later, coming out that cupboard," and this is her words, she says, "I saw a red Indian coming out of my cupboard." She goes, "I saw him from the chest upwards." And she says, "I could see him in detail. He had a feathered headdress, he had the wall paint, he had a necklace made of bones or something, and he was doing this as he was trying to come out of the cupboard." She goes, "Only from the waist up, that's all I could see." She goes, "Behind him, I could see another person in the shadows, and behind him a third person appeared to have a hat on." But she could clearly see this native, well, I would call it Native American Indian, but she called him Red Indian, coming out of the cupboard. Now, she goes, "I know you wouldn't laugh, because I told my doctor and he just laughed at me." She goes, "But I know you won't laugh." But around that time, there was a film and a book that had come out called The Indian in the Cupboard. And so at the same time, I was trying to not laugh at the same time, because it's just my wicked sense of humour. But at the same time, I was kind of gobsmacked by what she was telling me. And I said, "Have you heard of spirit guides?" And she goes, "No." This lady wasn't from a spiritualist background or anything like that. And yet, she was experiencing what I perceived to be a spirit guide. And the reason I say that is that in spiritualism, you have mediums and you have seances and things like that, and a communication between the living and the dead going on. And when they have seances, they normally have someone like a spirit guide comes through who works with a medium, and they will act as what they call a doorkeeper to keep the naughty children or the naughty spirits at bay or something like that, and they'll help bring people through. Now, typically, in the world of spiritualism, they tend to be Native American Indians, they can be Chinese guides, but they seem to be people that, if they're on Earth, they're a very spiritual race. I mean, the Native Americans are very, very spiritual, and they still are today. And so they're kind of leagues ahead of us in the sense of spirituality and understanding of the Earth and the universe and things like that. So that when they pass on, they're so much more advanced than the average person here that they have this ability of maybe doing many more things than we could. And so they act as guides, and they come back as guides and will explain philosophy and all sorts of things through mediums and stuff. And quite often they'll show up in seances and physical seances to act as a kind of master of ceremonies to keep the order of what's happening. And I believe what this lady was describing was a classic spirit guide. And as I said, she had no understanding of this at all. And yet here she was witnessing something that is not constrained by belief systems or anything like that. She wasn't tainted with any background knowledge of this. And yet here she was being an independent witness to a phenomenon that maybe some of you have heard about. And so this wasn't just a one-off. She said that this was happening every night. She would wake up and see this manifestation of this Native American guide coming out of the cupboard, doing this, and trying to bring someone through. And she goes, what do I do about it? And I said, well, look, I'll tell you what I think it is, and then I'll suggest what maybe you can do. I said, I think that what happened when your husband died, what you saw as a mist rising out of his chest was possibly his spirit. And I think that you're very, very psychic to be able to see that, because not everyone will. And I said, and your cupboard over there is acting as a doorway. I said, think of a revolving doorway you would get in a hotel room. You can go in it, but you can come out of it, and it's continually revolving. I said, that doorway of your cupboard there, the airing cupboard, is acting as a portal. And I explained that I think that what her husband, the spirit guide was trying to do was bring her husband back. And I said, I bet your husband didn't believe in this kind of stuff, did he? And she goes, no, he thought it was a load of old rubbish. I said, I think that that's the key, that your husband is possibly the gentleman behind the spirit guide. And this spirit guide is trying to bring him back, and it's coming back through that cupboard. And I'll explain cupboards a little bit later on, and doorways later on, because I think there's a key to that within the whole of this phenomenon. Lots of people cite ghosts standing in doorways and things. I mean, my mum said that when her own father died, many years ago now, back in 1977, maybe a year later, she said that she saw her own father stand in the doorway of her bedroom, rolling up his cigarettes, just smiling and looking at her. And she goes, Dad, what are you doing here? And he just smiled and carried on rolling cigarettes. And there'll be more to hear from him a little bit later. So I suggested to her that maybe that she should ask this spirit guide questions and try and find out what he wants. I said, if you don't get any answers, then I suggest then you contact the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain in London or the College of Psychic Studies. I said, call up 192, because this was pre-internet days, and just call them up and tell them what you've told me and see what they say, because I'm sure that they could give you a lot better advice than I could at that time. So I never found out what happened. I remember getting in my car afterwards and thinking, oh my God, and I didn't want to look in my rear view mirror in case I saw someone in there, and just drove off like shaking like that. But yeah, I felt that I was her only hope for that night, that she hadn't got a clue what to do. Her doctor was obviously washing his hands of the whole affair, and so really I was like a helping hand, which I was glad to be in some respects. Now, when I said about the Indian in the cupboard, I mentioned about spiritualism in general, and there's mediums. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen some mediums do demonstrations, and there's a thing called mental mediumship. So if you think of your people like Tony Stockwell, Colin Fries, Doris Stokes from the 80s, and Doris Collins, there's always called Doris in the 80s, weren't there? And now we have more male mediums for some reason. It used to be lady mediums in the 80s, and now we seem to have an influx of male mediums. When they're out demonstrating, and I've studied mediumship myself, I've done a little bit, I wouldn't put myself in their category, but when they're doing it, they're doing something called mental mediumship, and those that are in psychic circles will perhaps understand what I'm talking about, is that they're getting impressions, and they'll see a picture in their mind, usually maybe a word or a thought, and they'll convey that to the sitter in the audience, and they might see, for instance, an example I had when I was doing some readings for people in a room. I was talking to a lady over this side of the room, and suddenly I got the words just pop in my head. Colin France, Colin France, Colin France. And I said, do you know a Colin of France? And she goes, no. And I went, ooh, okay, I'm wrong on that one. I said, can anybody else take the name Colin and France? And someone put their hand up. He goes, yeah, this guy in the corner could. And it turned out that it was his friend Colin who died in France. And I was also getting the words holiday and not holiday, holiday and not holiday. And it's very confusing. And so I was trying to make head or tail of it. And it turned out that Colin worked in France doing holiday business. So he was not on holiday, but he was to do with holidays. And this is how the message come through. They come through almost like smoke signals. They don't come through often with a full kind of name and address of people, but having said that, I have seen people that have done that information. They're very, very good mediums. And that's what you call mental mediumship. You don't see any, as Doris Stokes used to say, you don't see people climbing up the curtains or anything like that. You just see them giving messages. There's another level to it, which is what they call physical mediumship. And that's where you get people going into trances, and a medium might convey the voice of a spirit guide who then speaks with their vocal cords. And even to a more rarer degree, you get something called physical mediumship, where there's materialization mediumship. And that is where spirits will try and manifest physically in a room. Now, the science of it is still kind of unknown to a certain extent, but the typical scenario would be, if we were doing that here, at this end of the room, if I was a medium, I'd have something what they call a trance cabinet, okay? And the best way to describe it, if you think of a toilet tent that you get in your camping holidays, okay? Today they kind of use those, but in Victorian times and before, they used to have like kind of blinds and things like that. The medium would sit in this toilet tent and then typically be strapped in or velcroed into a chair, and the whole thing would be shut down before them, and there might be infrared lights, and maybe after half an hour a bit of music and things like that. Manifestations of spirits. Now, there was a lady in the wartime called Helen Duncan. Again, a lot of people might have heard of her. She was a Scottish medium, and she was bringing back sailors who had gone down on boats during the wartime, and she was actually put away by the authorities because the information she was bringing back was wanted to be kept stum by the authorities, because they didn't want people to know that these boats were sinking, thus destroying the morale of the British people at the time. And so they put her into prison under what was then called the Witchcraft Act, and they tried her as a witch. Basically, it's the only thing they could find in their law books that put her away. They needed her out of the picture for that time. But she was actually bringing back dead sailors who would physically manifest, and they'd come through with their hats on it and actually say the name of their ships, HMS whatever, and news was getting out of these sinkings before the MOD or the Ministry of Defence, whoever they were at the time, wanted the people to know about these things, you see. So how they would come out is that these beings would come out as their... Has anyone heard of ectoplasm? Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. They come out as ectoplasm, basically, and it normally comes out of nostrils, throats, and all sorts of other places I won't even go into. And then come out as solid form, maybe for a temporary amount of time, and walk around the room. I mean, there was a case I read or heard about, a guy called Tom Harris. His mother was a medium, and she was called Minnie Harris. And she was a physical medium, and she used to manifest spirits. And I think there was a gentleman there once who wanted to take the pulse of a medium, a spirit that came through. And he said, do you mind if, I think he was a doctor actually, he said, do you mind if I take the pulse of you? And this spirit put their arm out, and he took and timed the pulse, and it was perfectly healthy. And he said, yeah, he said, you'll definitely live to this spirit. You're very healthy. So that's what kind of things that happen in those physical seances, okay? And I've had experiences, not of manifestation, well I have, but I think they're slightly fake, but I've had experiences of things called transfiguration as well. And that is where a face would appear over the over the medium's face of a spirit. And they use these infrared lights because they will black out the whole room. And so the infrared lights is the only thing you've got to see what's happening. And I remember going to this mediumship demonstration, and this guy was bringing through his spirit guide, and he was supposedly having this face change to him. And people in the room were going, wow, look at that, oh my God, it's amazing. But I couldn't see anything myself, and I couldn't understand why. So during the break, this spirit guide said, does anyone have any questions? So of course I was right at the front. I said, yes, I do. I said, can you bring through anybody? And he goes, yes, we can. So I thought, okay. So he says, come here, my friend. So I sat on a chair in front of him, held his hands as he directed me to do, and there are these two little lights there that were going to shine into this medium's face, infrared light, and he would bring his face forward, and the idea was I would see a materialised face, like a mask, over the medium's face. Well, he was putting his face into the lights. I couldn't see a damn thing, and yet I could hear everyone behind me, or a lot of people saying, oh my God, look at that face, it's amazing, look at the nose, it's getting bigger, look at the ears and things. I thought, well, I can't see a thing here. And I said, I'm really sorry, but I can't see anything happening. So he says, well, try again, my friend. And again, he put his face into the lights, and I watched. Again, I could hear the gasps of wonderment from the audience, and I thought, well, I can't see a damn thing. But I felt the pressure was on me to say, well, thank you very much, that's lovely, and just walk away. But I thought, no, I'm going to stand my ground. So he said, we'll try one more time. So for a third time, he put his face into the lamps, and it was illuminated by the red lamps, and I was watching carefully. And again, I could hear the people in the background saying, wow, look at that face. And I said, I'm really, really sorry, but I can't see a thing. So he said to the lady that was organising it, this is the spirit guide saying this through the guy in trance, he said, Jeanette, can you make sure our friend here gets a full refund? And she goes, oh yeah, I will. So I thought, well, that's all right. But I'm still waiting for my refund. So I always said, the spirit world owes me 20 quid, basically. Now, I've been to other seances where you might have heard they have these cones, where they're sounds cones, like trumpets. And the idea of that is that the ectoplasm we mentioned earlier will manifest like a minute voice box in the small end of this trumpet. And around this trumpet is an luminous band of tape, so that when all the lights go dark, the luminosity of this band of tape will glow, so you can see something moving around. Well, I watched this tube or trumpet fly around the room. I say fly around the room. I was at one end, but he didn't want to go down that end of the room. It's a very small room. And the medium, now this is what leads me into the areas of suspicion, and this is why you've got to be on your guard against these things, is that the medium, when I went to the door, I was searched and everything, because this is what they do. They search you for cameras, watches, anything reflective, recording devices you're not allowed to take in. The medium turns up and he's wearing a wig and a great big false moustache and dark glasses. And you know that 118 advert, you got the two guys that like bed. It was like that. He looked like something out of a Quentin Tarantino film, you know. And he goes, "Hi, I'm the medium," and he's like got a very big moustache, and half his moustache kept falling off as he's talking. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how much have I paid for this, you know? So I went in this seance room and I had to hold hands with the people around me, and the medium was putting his hand on the radiator, then he was holding hands with the lady next to him, and then I was next to this lady holding her hand and holding a hand of someone next to me. The idea is it daisy chains around until you come back to the radiator. So he was the trance medium for that night, and unbelievably the cone was next to him. So when it went into the darkness, you saw this cone lift off the table and move around. You could see it. And in the darkness they'd say, "Oh, Neil, I think that cone's coming towards you." And of course the cone did move towards me. And so there it was in front of me. In the darkness I could see the luminous band illuminating it. And they said, "I think the spirits want to say something to it. Why don't you talk to them, Neil?" I went, "Hello? Anyone in there?" And I thought, I've just paid 30 quid to talk to a cardboard shoe, basically. And I thought, if this guy was genuine, first of all, he wouldn't have a wig and dark glasses and a moustache that kept hanging off. And also, the cone fly to the other end of the room, surely. It was only within arm's reach. And of course, he was holding onto the radiator, so in the darkness, he could lift his right hand off the radiator, pick up the cone, move it around the people within that vicinity, and then put it back down again. It was interesting, though, but halfway through, he dropped the cone accidentally on the floor, and the spirits, unbelievably, couldn't lift it back up again. So I had to help the spirits by lifting up the cone for them. They were very grateful, and that was it. So, I mean, I never accused them of fakery, but I just kind of added it all up afterwards. I thought, no, that was definitely fake, and my friend thought so too as well. So this is the thing, you've got to be careful. Don't sort of, you know, have your logic and your wits about you when you go to these things, and weigh it up in your own mind. I mean, I did do a bit of research afterwards on this guy, and I went onto Amazon and found that he had written books, how to fake seances. So it was an obvious kind of closed case for that. That's what he was doing. I would have thought that if you're going to be a medium and you want to be as honest as you can with people, you wouldn't have a disguise on for starters. And he gave some weird name like Freddie, whatever, I can't remember his surname, Freddie Valentine or something like that, which wasn't his real name. If you're going to be a medium and you're attempting to bring back the so-called dead, you've got to be as honest as you can, really. It was just a total farce. But you live and learn through these things. Okay, so yeah, where do we go from here? Yeah. Now, last year, my mum unfortunately passed to the spirit world. She was nearly 80, and it was a totally unexpected event. My brother lived in the house where it happened, and I was actually staying overnight there where it happened, because I make films as well. I do my research and I interview people, and I was editing some of my films on the Apple Mac that I kept at the house. And we'd gone downstairs to watch, I think it was Time Team that evening, and then I made him a cup of tea. I said, right, I'm going back upstairs to carry on editing my films. And my mum normally went to bed at 10 o'clock at night. And on this particular occasion, my dad shouted up the stairs to say that your mum's going to bed at 10 o'clock, but she wants me to go to bed with her because she doesn't feel well, and she wants me to go to bed with her. And I thought, that's a very unusual thing to do, because normally, when my mum's felt unwell in the past, she'd just say, oh, I'm going off to bed, and she'd go off to bed, crawl upstairs as best she could because she had poorly legs, and my dad would stay and watch war films or whatever on the TV till about midnight. So I thought, this is a very unusual thing. Why is my dad going to bed with her? So I said, right, okay, I shouted down. And then about 10 minutes later, my mum got to the top of the stairs, and I could feel that, you know, I could definitely hear that she was panting and breathing and that, and I just shouted around the corner of the door, I hope you feel better in the morning. But as I said that, I felt very uneasy. There was an unknowing, the statement I made didn't seem to be qualified. It didn't feel easy within me. What I was saying, it didn't feel right. I hope you feel better in the morning. It just didn't sound right to me. I didn't know why. I just felt uneasy as I said it. I thought something's up and I don't know what it is. And anyway, after about an hour, I switched off the computer and I went downstairs and I thought, I'll watch something on TV or YouTube or something like that. I had the headphones in. And after another hour, I could hear a lot of thumping and noise from upstairs. And I thought, crikey, there's a lot of noise upstairs. And my dad shouted from upstairs, he goes, Neil, your mum's fainted. So I went upstairs and he goes, basically I went in the room and there she was, and she wasn't fainted, she was actually dead. I could tell she was as white as the wall, and I knew that she had passed over straight away. When I put my hand on her neck to try and feel any signs of life, there was nothing. And anyway, of course, ambulances and everything came along and she was declared dead about 4 o'clock that morning. It was obviously a very traumatic time, we wasn't expecting it. And of course, after the funeral and things like that, me and my brothers are all talking. And my brother Phil, who lived at the house, but he wasn't there on that particular night, he said for 3 weeks before she actually died that he could smell the tobacco smoke of our granddad. And that was the gentleman I mentioned earlier, who my mum had seen in the doorway rolling cigarettes. He could smell the tobacco smoke of our granddad. And he thought, that's Grandad Bob's smoke. Why am I smelling that? For 3 weeks prior to that. And then a week before she died, he said he was in his bed, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, the door would open up, and in came my mum, looking 30 to 40 years younger than she actually was, holding out a dress like that, skipping through the bedroom with a smile on her face, and she went straight through the room. And he said it was like a silent movie, no sound whatsoever, and she went straight through the window at the end. And he thought, God, what am I seeing here? He said that was a week before she died. It's actually interesting, the Society of Psychical Research has cited on its casebooks that a lot of apparitions that are seen are phantasms of the living, people that haven't died. And yet people are seeing them in possible places they possibly can't be, like another part of the world, say. And it's my idea that maybe, based upon things that I've read, that maybe the spirit world was coming to get her, and my granddad's smoke was an indication that he was around for at least 3 weeks getting ready for this departure. And maybe my brother seeing my mum coming through the bedroom was a sign that she was actually going to depart this world soon. But it was an unconscious projection of her spirit, or an out-of-body experience that she wasn't even aware of herself. I've read in books that the spirit world try and impress people that are sensitive, and my brother is sensitive to this sort of thing. They try and impress people in the family that a departure or a death is about to take place, and they try and do it in some way to allow them so that it's not such a shock to the family that a departure is about to happen. And I think in hindsight, of course, it's only when you have this vision of hindsight that I realised that maybe that was what was happening, is that we were seeing evidence of that my mum was about to depart this world. Okay? So it's an interesting point there. My mum believed in this kind of thing as well, so we did get a message through maybe about 3 months later from this medium. He was a bit all over the shop with his messages, but he did give out the name Margaret, and he honed in on me, and I knew that was my mum, so I knew that she was okay. And I've had contact with her in the dream state, and I'm sure a lot of people here tonight have had contact with their loved ones in the dream state. And the reason I think that happens is that when you're dreaming, your conscious challenging mind is put to the side, and you have the unchallenging mind that is prepared to accept statements as fact or as whatever. So that's why you see rabbits driving down the road in your dream and you just take it as normal, you see. Whereas in the normal state, if you saw a rabbit driving down the road, you think, what on earth's that? But in our subconscious, we can accept pretty much anything. And that's when the departed can come through and give information to say they're okay or whatever, because you're not going to hopefully challenge that statement from them, and they can get messages through that way. Okay? So yeah, phantasms of the living there. Right, just moving on a bit. Now, there's talking of ghosts. I mean, typically people say that we're frightened of ghosts and things like that. I mean, my granddad just had this statement that he used to say. He said, it's not the dead you want to be afraid of, it's the bloody living. I think that's quite a true statement, in fact. But there was a case where a guy was telling me that he was on a motorbike with a friend one night, and they were going down this lonely road, and they could clearly see down this road what appeared to be a spirit going across the road. He said it was hovering about a foot off the road. It seemed to have like a cloak or something, and this spirit looked towards him. It could actually interact with them and see them coming towards it. And this spirit actually got frightened. He said the look of terror on this spirit's face as the motorbike got closer and closer, it went, oh my God, and zoomed to the outside of the road and then looked as the motorbike passed. He said then they saw it vanish. And the people on the motorbike were so scared they drove for another 5 miles before they put the brakes on and took a breather to establish, did you see what I saw type of thing? They said, yeah, we both saw this ghost or spirit that appeared to be scared. So that is a very rare case of maybe ghosts getting freaked out by the living, which I thought was an interesting take on things. Right, okay, what have we done? Yeah, now there's harder nuts to crack with this, because I've talked about fairies and spirits, but then you go into a world where things just don't make sense. I mean, we talked about the tiny fairy cutting around the shoe with a shadow. That didn't make sense. And there's other things that don't qualify as spirits or ghosts, and you think, what could they be? There was a case many, many years ago. I worked at this TV place, and I overheard a conversation with this security guard that was from the West Indies, and he was talking to this girl in the kitchen there, because they did night shifts and everything like that. And he talked to this girl, and I heard him mention, he said, oh, she was as white as that fridge freezer. And I thought, what's he talking about? So my ears pricked up, and I thought, this sounds ghostly. I want to get into this conversation. So I said, what are you talking about, Owen? Because his name was Owen. What are you talking about? He says, oh, this woman I saw. I said, well, what do you mean? What woman? He says, this woman I saw sitting on a church roof. I went, what? A woman sitting on a church roof? He goes, yeah. I laughed. You know, how's she doing? What's a woman doing sitting on the church roof? He said, well, this was no ordinary woman. She was at least 50 foot tall. I was like, what? I thought, no wonder they're always trying to raise money for the church roof. All these 50-foot women sitting on church roofs, for God's sake. Where he used to live, in the West Indies, on one of the islands, I think it may have been St. Lucia, but I don't know for sure. He said that he lived there and he would come regularly from the bar that he used to drink with his pal, and they'd come around this particular road, and there was always a church there on the route home. And on this particular occasion, they were coming down the road, and as they came around the corner, there was the church. But on the church, on this particular occasion, was this 50-foot tall woman sitting on the church. And if you imagine that we all sat over a doll's house and we crouched over like a doll's house like that, that was the kind of scenario that came to my mind of this woman sitting on this doll's house, except that she had white hair, a very white face, like a white kind of gown he described it as, and she was just sitting on top of this church roof. So his friend was freaking out. His friend hid behind the gravestone in fear. And so he obviously said, you can see what I can see then? Because obviously he was checking, am I hallucinating? He says, you can see what I see? He goes, yeah, I see it too. So Owen, being the more braver of the two, he picked up a rock. Now, that's not a good idea. And he threw it as hard as he could at this 50-foot woman giant sitting on the church roof. And I said, oh my God, you know, what happened then? And he said, well, she stood up. And I said, oh, I don't know about you, but if I go throw stones at 50-foot women, I'm out of there, you know. She got off and started to walk towards them. And then she slowly diminished in size and then eventually shrank in and dissipated into the ground. And this is the weird thing, that he saw such an astounding thing that was witnessed by his friend. He says, but I don't believe in ghosts or ghoulies or things that go bump in the night. I said, but how can you say that when you've just experienced something so amazing? Because I know what I saw, but I don't believe it. And I think it was his way of protecting himself from that reality, that he had fear that he didn't want to acknowledge or that he didn't want to face it. And he said that when he finally came to this country, he married an English lady, and he said that he was driving home one day in the evening, and as he was driving down this road, it's a 30-mile-an-hour zone, he suddenly looked in his rearview mirror and he saw a woman sitting in the back of his car. And he looked back and there was no one physically there, but there he could see a woman sitting in the back of his car. So of course, it alarmed him, and without realising, he put his foot on the accelerator and started speeding. He wanted to get home as quickly as possible. And of course, a police car caught him, beep, 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 pulled him over. And they said, do you realise you were doing 50 in a 30 zone? And he says, yeah, I'm really sorry, officer. The reason is, you won't believe me, but I saw a woman sitting in the back of my car. But he said, all that changed. They said, they looked at him and went, oh, that's okay, you can go. He said, it's almost as if they knew this story from before, that other people had seen this woman sitting in the backs of people's cars. I'm going to try that one myself. Never know. They might be forgiven in the courts. But yeah, I think he was very, very psychic. But again, he still didn't believe in this sort of thing. Now, I mentioned that he saw ghosts in the mirror, and it's actually an interesting thing that lots of spirits have been sighted in mirrors. Now, I always wonder about the Egyptian scrying mirrors that people talked about in the past, and whether the Egyptians were onto something, in fact they could see something in the mirror. And of course you've got the idea of Snow White and the talking mirror, again from that legend, and the mirror's talking wisdom about who's the fairest of them all. Again, these legends or stories, I think there's some basis to a kind of scientific angle behind it all that we haven't really acknowledged. There was another guy that I got to do a talk because I run a paranormal meet-up group in High Wycombe, and a guy that I came to get to do a talk for me, he was a ghost researcher. He used to go out to these places with all his cameras and recording devices and try and capture proof of ghosts. Now, in his day job, he worked for the RAC, and he worked, as well as repairing cars. He said that they had the contract to repair ambulances for the NHS. And he said that he was qualified that if a vehicle like an ambulance wasn't able to be driven, or legally driven, he was allowed to drive it back to the garage to be fixed. So, of course, it happened one night that there was this ambulance that had busted and it couldn't be legally driven by the ambulance driver, so he turned up and says, okay, I'll drive it back to the garage and get it repaired. So he jumped in, went to adjust the mirror, and he saw a girl in the rearview mirror that wasn't actually physically sitting in the back of the ambulance, but he could see her in the mirror. And of course he freaked out. He said, although he's a ghost hunter, and he should be used to this sort of thing, just seeing the sight of someone that's sitting in the mirror in the back of his ambulance, it freaked him out. And he said he got on the mobile to his girlfriend, who's also a fellow ghost hunter with him. He said, you won't believe this, but I can see a spirit of a lady in the back of this ambulance. And so she was saying, oh, well, talk to it, ask it questions and things like that. And he said, no. He said I would have been more calmer had she been sitting in the ambulance with me. Then I would have been much more rational because there's someone to hold his hand, so to speak. But because he was by himself, it completely freaked him out. So again, he turned the mirror away and just carried on driving the ambulance back to the depot. So I do believe that spirits trying to communicate through mirrors as well. But it also opens up another point of interest, is that the fact that a lot of these spirits are in ambulances. People go around looking for ghosts in graveyards and things like that, and I don't think that's where the likeliest place to find them. I think the places you're likely to find these spirits that are anchored to the physical world in some way is where they perhaps passed over. And obviously ambulances are where a lot of people die on arrival, don't they, at hospitals. They're dead in the ambulance. And of course, the person that's coming out of their body is confused about where they are. And somehow, either they're leaving a recording on the atmosphere of their last part of earthly experience, or they're physically still haunting that ambulance as well. I know someone that worked as a trainee nurse at hospitals, and she told me that part of the training, and I don't know if this is across the whole of the NHS across Britain, I can't say, and maybe if there's anyone that's involved in hospitals or medicine might have an angle on this to tell as well, but she said that the training she was getting at the time said that if they felt when they got home after a shift at work that there was a spirit of a person around them, that they had to go back to the hospital to have it dealt with. So it was getting such a problem that the NHS was getting issues with it. Lots of people, nurses and doctors, were reporting spirits are hanging around them because obviously they're dying in hospitals. Now, a number of years ago, again, I was sitting around a campfire and was all celebrating someone's 50th, and this particular lady around the campfire, she knew me. She says, come on, Neil, tell us some of your ghostly stories. And so there's obviously a lot of people there that I didn't know, so I started to relate some of those ghostly stories. And this girl, she said, I'm a nurse. She goes, and I'll tell you this, I don't normally tell people this, but she goes, I work at a hospital. And she goes, I know this to be true because I know the doctor that it happened to, she said. She goes, where I work, on the third floor of this hospital, there is this room where all the patients are so seriously ill on these beds, and they're all hooked up to machines that are monitoring their heartbeat and brainwaves and all sorts of gizmos. And as soon as one of those machines throws an alarm, the doctors on the next floor above are paged, and they have to run down the stairs quickly and try and resuscitate the patients, okay? So of course it happened, an alarm went off, their pagers, 3 doctors ran down the stairs, because it's quicker than taking the lifts. They just run down 2 flights of stairs and they're in the room and they can start to resuscitate someone. As they were running down the stairs, there in front of them, as they're trying to run down the stairs, was this girl sitting on the stairs, and it was a patient. From her gown that they could see, it was a patient. She was sitting on the stairs, crouched up, doubled up in agony, and they said, what are you doing here? And all she kept saying to them is that my stomach hurts, my stomach hurts. And that's all she would say. And they said, well, look, stay here, you should be here, you should be in bed. We'll send someone back to help you, okay? But we've got to go and deal with the patient. And so they carried on running down to the floor where this patient that they was paged about was dead or needed to be resuscitated. And they got there, and the same girl that was dead on that table there was the same girl that had passed on the stairs. And of course they went back to the stairs and she was no longer there. Now asks a few questions. My mum said, she was obviously alive when I told her this story, she said, but hang on, if that girl has died and that's her spirit, why was she in pain? And I said, well, I think, and I can't prove it of course, but I think that maybe, and there's something called the astral cord, people talk about astral cords and things, which is like an umbilical cord that supposedly connects the physical body to the spirit body. I mean, in the Bible they talk about lest the silver cord be snapped or broken or cut or something like that. Maybe it was referring to that, I don't know. But a lot of people that have gone astrally out of their body or out of their body experiences, they sometimes are sighted seeing like an umbilical cord that connects their spirit body to the physical body. And the idea is that when that is cut or severs in some way, that's you gone. You're off to the spirit world or wherever, and that's permanent death of the physical body. In the same way that we come into this world, we are connected to our mother's womb by an umbilical cord. I think we're perhaps going out in a similar fashion. Now, I think that what happened was that this astral cord had snapped in some way as this girl had died, but because she could still be seen by the doctors and was still interacting with our world by sitting on that staircase, she was slightly within our world to a certain extent, slightly physical. So therefore, she was feeling the sensations of pain in her mind perhaps. And so where this cord perhaps snapped, she remembered that issue and it was affecting her. And that's why she was saying, my stomach hurts, because the cord is obviously connected to where it is in the spiritual body. And of course these 3 doctors have seen it, and they don't like to talk about that sort of thing, do they? And yet they're seeing these things all the time. So it's an interesting tale. Now, I have heard a similar tale that was reported by a guy who's a researcher in Hastings called Malcolm Robinson. Anyone know Malcolm Robinson? Yeah, you know Malcolm. Now, he was doing a radio interview about 3 or 4 weeks ago at a radio station that I'm involved in, funny enough, and I wasn't actually involved in that recording, but I was listening to it later on. And he said someone on his Facebook page told him a story almost so identical to the one that I've just told you that I actually thought, is this something that's going around hospitals, like a normal story or what? I don't know. But he said in the story that he had, someone on his Facebook told him a story where this doctor was talking to this guy who was out of bed, a patient. He kept saying, what are you doing out of bed? You've got to be back in your bed, you've got to be back in your bed. And this guy was just being confused about stuff. He didn't sort of mutter much at all. And of course, when the doctor was paid to go and resuscitate someone, he went to the bed, and it's the same guy just been talking to. And so in Malcolm's story, they went back and checked the CCTV cameras in the hospital ward. They could see the doctor talking, but they couldn't see the person he was actually talking to, that he claimed to be talking to, because he was invisible. But there was this doctor seeing him. So I think there's cases that medical people are seeing these things as well. And I think privately amongst themselves, they'll admit to certain strange things, but they don't want to tell the public. They're keeping it under their hat, so to speak. But there is one doctor that's quite happy to talk about it, and that's a guy called Ian Rubenstein. He's a GP from Enfield. That's the place where the Enfield poltergeist occurred in the 70s, if anyone knows about that case. He actually treats people that are members of the family from the Enfield poltergeist case, who's got quite a few stories to tell about that. I've been telling Andy about him, so that Andy may hopefully contact him. Maybe you can get him down maybe for next year. He's a very good speaker, but he'll tell you some interesting stories where he's seen spirits in his own surgery room whilst he's been treating patients for depression and things like that. And he said that when he was younger, he also happened to see a transfiguration occur. He was dating this young girl. He's about 18, she's about 17. And he was playing with her emotions a bit, he said at the time. And his sister was in the room with him. And suddenly, this girl, her face completely changed. It went completely white, and her lips went like frosty. And he said to him, it was like looking at the Snow Queen. And suddenly this voice spoke out and the lips moved, and they said in a completely different voice from the girl, stop playing with her emotions, in a very authoritative way. And he went, oh my God. And his sister screamed. And again he said, what, you can see this as well? And she goes, yeah. Both of them saw it, his sister and himself. They saw this transfiguration. And he described it as rock jaw experience, and that's from a doctor. And he goes on to talk about this kind of thing in public. He's quite happy to acknowledge there's a spiritual realm. He's even been in slightly developing circles, so that's quite a thumbs up for materialistic science a little bit. There's actually people on our side out there. So yeah, certainly try and get Ian Rubenstein on to do a talk for you, because it'd be a fascinating evening. Right, let's just go further down here. Right. Okay, yeah. I've got my own transfiguration tales. As I say, I've experimented with mediumship myself. And many years ago, I was reading various books about how to channel spirit guides. And my ex-wife Alison felt that I had the spirit guide called Henry with me, who was a writer. Now this is a weird one, is that I said, I was a bit dubious. Can Henry, this writer, author, prove his existence to me? And she said in trance, yes, he will prove his existence in some way or form within the next week. And the following week, I kind of went into trance and I brought this spirit guide through. And I got Alison to write down any questions or anything like that, but also tell me what she experienced. And she said that she could see with the torch, because it was a dark room, she had a torch with the questions, she could see this mist forming over my face. And she said she could see sideboards, because she felt that this Henry was from Victorian times. She could see sideboards over my face. I said, well, maybe I was channeling Elvis or something. I was all shook up. But he spoke and answered questions, and one of the questions I said, okay, if you're a writer, can you tell me one of the books that you wrote? And in trance, I spoke the words, yes. One of the books I wrote was called The Lost Boys. Now, around that time, there was that film that had come out with Kiefer Sutherland, The Lost Boys, and I thought, no, I'm going to write that one off. That's subconscious tricks there. That's because that film's come out, The Lost Boys, Kiefer Sutherland, vampires. So I discarded that information. Then about a week later, I was working at a place and I jumped in the back of someone's car at work. We were all going to pop down to the town during the lunch break to get some things. And I said, oh, do you mind if I have a lift? And he says, yeah, hop in. And another guy said, oh, do you mind if I have a lift too? So instead of me sitting at the front as the intention, I then had to hop into the back seat. So I hopped in the back seat. And if I hadn't hopped into the back seat, I wouldn't have known about this book that was there. Okay? That's the important thing. This is why someone else had to come to put me in the back seat. Next to me on the back seat was a book. And I picked it up. And it's called The Third Wise Man by a chap called Henry Van Dyke. I thought, that spirit guide is called Henry that I've been dealing with. That's interesting. So looked and it said Henry Van Dyke was Victorian. I thought, oh my God, this guy's Victorian as well. So flicked over the covers. It said other books by Henry Van Dyke. And I went through the list. And one of them was called The Lost Boy. And I thought, oh my God. I'd said The Lost Boys only a week earlier. And here it was, stating that he'd written a book called The Lost Boy. And he said also that it proved his existence to me within 1 week, and that was a week later. So I thought, well, crikey, is that evidence or what? I'm not saying it's total proof, but it's something that's a bit uneasy. So I said to my friend, John, is this your book? And he goes, no, not really. I said, well, where did it come from? He says, oh, it belongs to my sister's friend. I had to give her a lift to the station. She just kind of left it there. I said, oh, does she want it back then? He goes, well, no, I'm not really likely to see her again. So I said, can I have this book? And he goes, yeah, sure, you can have it. So I took it. And so I've always kept that book, because to me that's always kind of been external evidence of the existence of a spirit guide that said he proves existence to me. There's also another spirit guide that I dealt with in my development circle in the late 80s. This lady used to go into trance, and she used to bring forth this man called Manico, who was an African spirit guide, allegedly, something like 700 years old. And he would speak, and to me, when I first saw it, I was as doubting as anybody, because to me, the voice when it came through, it sounded like Fuzzy Bear at the Muppets. You know, that sort of stuff. And of course, when you get that kind of thing, you just want to stare at the floor or try not to bite your teeth or something, and you're trying not to laugh. And I kept thinking, oh God, this is as fake as anything. And anyway, this lady Margaret was going to come along the following time and demonstrate Manico again. Now, I've been reading various spiritual books in the interim, and one of these books was channeled by a spiritual entity called Seth. I don't know if anyone's heard of Seth, some of you have. Now, he said in one of his books that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He was substituted by another man, you see? And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing. I wonder if this Manico, Fuzzy Bear, would know anything about this. So I was going to go with this question to ask Manico. But unfortunately, I was ill the day it happened, so I couldn't make it. So I rang up a friend of mine that was going to go, and I said, could you ask on my behalf, but don't say it was me, just can you ask this Manico if he knows anything about Jesus being substituted on the cross, and did he really die on the cross? So she goes, yeah, I'll ask him, okay. So anyway, the next day, she rang up, and she said, he kind of didn't really know the answer. And I said, oh, there you go, they must be fake, this guy, you know, this woman's putting on a funny voice or something like that. And it was recorded, and about a week later I was given a recording of the session, and I could hear what was happening. And he said, it appears we don't know the answer, in his funny kind of voice. You know. And I said, well, that's got to be, she's putting on a funny voice, doing Fuzzy Bear, and she doesn't know the answer. She's not really maybe channeling a spirit guide. So I carried on experimenting with my own channeling, trancing, whatever you want to call it, because I had this brilliant book called How to Channel Your Spirit Guides. It gave complete instructions on how to do it. So I thought that night I was going to be channeling this Henry, the Victorian guy that left the book in the back of the car. And I was fully expecting Henry to show up. And I waited, and I started to feel strange sensations. My arms were going a bit funny, and pins and needles and that kind of stuff, which is what happens. And instead, I suddenly got the mental impression, the picture of Jesus on the cross, as if I was looking over the shoulder of him. Suddenly there. I thought, what am I seeing this for? I'm seeing Jesus on the cross. And then, this is the wondrous thing, I started to channel this voice of this Manico in this weird fuzzy bear voice that I'd taken the mick out of maybe a few weeks earlier. And he said, you were the one that asked the question. And I thought, oh my God. And I completely spluttered to a stop and came out of the trance because it completely freaked me out. So this Manico somehow knew that it was me that asked the question, and yet I wasn't even physically at that psychic circle. And my name wasn't even mentioned at the thing. This girl who asked on my behalf just said, I've got a question I want to ask you. And that was all that was said. Yet somehow this Manico knew and came to me because he knew that I asked the question. So there we go. From being a doubting Thomas, I became pretty much a believer in Fuzzy Bear from the spirit world. So, an interesting tale there. I don't do channeling now. I kind of leave it to other people because I think they're much better at me than it really. Now, I mentioned seances before. I mentioned the chap who had the infrared kind of lights and did transfiguration. I've also been to, as I mentioned earlier, physical seances where they supposedly manifest spirits. Okay. Now this one was called a Christmas seance with a chap called Bill Meadows. I'm quite happy to say the names of these people. His name is Bill Meadows. He's an elderly gent, and it's a place called Jenny's Sanctuary, which is just outside Banbury in Oxfordshire. And they have demonstrations of mediumship there. I've heard some interesting stories that have happened there. Can't prove they've happened, of course, but I've heard some interesting stories. One of the stories was a chap I was speaking there, he told me about a story. I said, what's the best thing that you've ever seen? And he said, well, I saw this thing where this Native American Indian came out of a trance cabinet, and he's like 7 foot tall. And he got a guy out from the audience, and he said, punch me on the chest like that. So this guy went, reluctantly. And the spirit guide said, punch me again, but harder. So he goes, all right then, whack. This guy didn't punch. He goes, punch me again really, really hard. So the guy, whack straight into the chest of this spirit guide. And this spirit guide didn't move. And then he went, just vanished into the floor like that, in front of everyone's eyes. I can't prove it, that's just what was related to me. And another guy that had been there said, what's happened to you? And he said, well, I was at a demonstration where they had a child's drum playing in the seance room, like that. And then the spirit guide announced that they would dematerialise the drum. And see what happened. And it dematerialised in front of them. And he said he saw bits fly off it, and it went around the room. He said one of the screws from this drum somehow ended up down the back of his chair, between his back and the chair. He could feel it against his spine, this screw. So he thought, well, I won't tell anyone, I'll just keep it there. But all the time he could feel the pressure of this screw against his back. And the spirit guide at the end said, right, we better put this drum back together now. That had been somehow dematerialised and bits were flying around the room. And he said he felt the screw sort of disappear from his back, behind his back. And I thought, oh my God. And they said there was this drum back together as it was. Which is an incredible story. Now, I went to this Christmas seance there, and this guy called Bill Meadows, they said he was a trance medium that would bring through manifestations. And so they had this trance cabinet there that I mentioned earlier, like the toilet tent scenario. He was velcroed into the chair at the front, very elderly chap, velcroed in there, and they had music, and we had to sing hymns and things like that to generate the energy. And voices started to come out of this cabinet, and I heard a voice that sounded to me a little bit like Dumbledore, if you think of Harry Potter, because it had a slight Richard Harris accent there going on, But I found out later this chap called Jonathan, he was supposedly a barrow boy from the East End of London that died in 1980, and yet he's coming through with a bit of an Irish accent. And I thought, that's a bit strange. Why does he sound like Richard Harris? He should be sounding like Dirty Den, really, shouldn't he? Something like that, So I couldn't quite understand what was going on there. And they said that also they're going to bring through the spirit of this little girl who was called Marie, I think her name was, and she was French, and she was a French Jew, and she died in the gas chambers in World War II. And they walked through, and you could see apparently the shape of this girl being impressed upon this cabinet. Through the material, you could see a shape being pressed there. She didn't actually physically come out. You could just see the shape of a girl, or a being of that height. And you heard this voice. Now, I was expecting an accent in French, going, hello, my name is Marie, or blah, 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 blah. But instead, if anyone's seen the children's program Tweenies, anyone familiar with the Tweenies? They talk, hello, hello, and think of the other, my daughter used to watch it as the Teletubbies, yeah, all the kind of silly voices. It was a voice exactly like that. And I thought, how can that be the voice of a French girl when it sounds like the Tweenies or the Teletubbies? It sounds ridiculous. It sounded like a man that would do an impersonation of a little girl. And also the other thing is like that comes to mind is the Punch and Judy. Hello, Mr. Punch. A voice just like that, which doesn't sound convincing. And I thought, this isn't right here. First of all, you got Richard Harris coming through, and then you got a Teletubby materialising in the seance room. This doesn't quite smack of sensationally accurate to me. So I thought, okay, there's drums being played. Again, there was drums at the front of this seance, and you could hear the darkness, some drums being played. And I thought, well, whoever's playing the drums is pretty good at playing the drums. That was one thing that was convincing. And because it was Christmas, they had a Christmas tree and they had little gifts wrapped up. And the lady who chaired it, which was the wife of Bill Meadows, said, you may get thrown a present in the darkness. And occasionally you'd hear kind of giggling and wrappings of things, and things would fly across through the darkness. And something landed in my hand, and it was a present. I unwrapped it and I could feel it, but I couldn't see what it was. It was only when the lights came on I found it was a child's doll, supposedly thrown to me by a spirit, apparently, in the night, in the darkness. So time went on, and I was still not quite sure about what was happening. And it was a room similar to this, where you got an aisle seat, and I would have been perhaps where that gentleman just down there is sitting, on the aisle, looking towards the cabinet here. And they announced that they felt the energy was right, that Jonathan would try and materialise his spirit hand under the trance cabinet. And this trance cabinet, the cloth rolled up a little bit like that, and they invited a gentleman from the front to come and shake hands, and you could see his hand come out like that from under it, lit by the infrared light, to come and shake hands and physically qualify that there was a materialised spirit hand coming out from under this cabinet. So this guy got up and he went to lift up the thing, and there was panic in the room. The woman, the wife, who was sitting there, she goes, no, don't lift it up, just keep it there, like that. And I thought, oh, why can't we see that? So he goes, oh, all right then. So this hand came out and shook him by the hand and then went back down again. And then he said, right, we're going to put the curtain down. The curtain went down, a bit more music, and went up and said, we think we've got enough energy now. Jonathan's going to try it again. The curtain went back up, and I could see the hand coming out onto the floor like this. And they said, notice there's no rings on the hand, because what they were trying to give the impression that it wasn't the medium's hand, because the medium had a wedding ring on, and this had no rings on it whatsoever. And someone in the darkness said, oh, it's dematerialising. As it snaked back under, they said it's dematerialising. So where I was sitting down the aisle, I thought, I've got a good view here. So I literally leant out my chair and went and looked like that to see if I could see under this trance cabinet. I could see the hand snake back, and then I sort of go back up like that. And I thought, that's not dematerialising. That's from the end of a body. You'd think it dissipates an energy or something into the floor. So I was really suspicious by this point. But this time they felt confident enough to invite everyone to come up and shake hands with Jonathan's hand. So everyone formed a queue, and it took about 15 minutes for everyone to go up and shake hands. So I was right at the back of the queue. And I went out, and finally I got there, and I shook hands with this materialised hand, but it felt human to me. Now, someone's told me, when you see a spirit hand materialise, or any part of a materialisation in a seance, it feels waxy to touch. It doesn't feel human. It's got a wax-like texture. So I felt, I'm not happy with this. I'm pretty sure this is somehow the medium's arm or an accomplice, because I knew later on that his brother was sitting at the front of this seance, you see. So at the end, when all the lights came up, they found Bill Meadows, who was in his chair, the medium. Instead of being inside this trance cabinet, he was actually outside of it, in the middle of the room somewhere. And everyone goes, oh my God, he's been dematerialised and brought into the room. Now, this chair had like the runners, like slidey runners, if you think of ski things. So it could easily, with the help of two people, be slid out silently with the music out through the curtain and just left there. And his wife and his brother could have easily done that. And I thought about it the next day. I thought, nah, I really wasn't happy about that. So I started again to look on the internet to see if there's anything about Bill Meadows, fake medium or something. And I found someone that had written a review. They'd been to a seance like I had about 4 years earlier. And they thought it was fantastic. They'd written a review, and literally everything they'd written in there was everything that had transpired the night before when I went there. It's almost as if they were working to a complete script. And magicians, when they're doing their tricks, they have to have a complete program of tricks to do, and the people that are accomplices have to know what to do at the right time to make the trick work. And I think this is exactly what's happening in the case of this medium. So I thought, okay, I've paid 30 quid for this, I've wasted my money, I think. Now, how can I prove that this is maybe a fake seance? Because, again, like the transfiguration thing I mentioned earlier, they check your watches, you have to take your phones out, anything reflective, glasses. They want to make sure that you're not going to perhaps expose them by saying that we can't have shiny objects in the seance room. So I thought, how could I do, if I went to this again, how could I shake hands with this spirit and kind of prove that it's a fake or not? And I thought, okay, I'm an artist, I paint with oil paints. Oil paints take about 3 or 4 days to dry, depending on thickness. If I put in the car park outside the building some oil paint on my hand, and then put an elastoplast plaster over my hand, covered it up with red paint, when they're checking me and I'm putting my arms up like that, like an airport security, they would see the plaster, but they'd think, oh, he just cut himself. It wouldn't even consciously, hopefully, register within their minds that that's anything to do with what I'm about to do. So when it's my turn to come up and shake hands with this Jonathan, I'd make sure I'm the last person in the queue to shake hands with him. And I'd come up the queue, and when I was about to shake hands and touch this materialised hand, if I suspected it being human, I'd take my plaster off, and there's the wet oil paint, the red oil paint, and I'd rub it all over his hand, like that. Because the only thing that can get that stuff off, and pardon the pun, is something called white spirit. And I don't think they're likely to have that in the room next door where they're having a cup of tea and biscuits, are they, really? So you could almost say that I caught him red-handed as well. So I plan to do that at some point, but you've got to be careful with these things, because you don't want to suddenly fling on the lights and things like that, because if they're genuine, it can actually be quite damaging to the medium. Helen Duncan, similar thing happened to her. She was the medium in the wartime that I mentioned earlier. People tried to expose her. People would raid the seance, they'd switch on the lights and everything, and the ectoplasm would shoot back into them because it's light sensitive, like film was, if you think of processing film. And it can actually cause injury to the medium, and that's what happened just after the wartime. Helen Duncan was injured by such an act where people were trying to expose her. And in fact, it wasn't the case. She was a genuine physical medium, and the ectoplasm went back into her, and it made her ill, and about 3 or 4 months later, she actually died. A lady I mentioned, I've spoken to her, she said that she had a problem with ectoplasm where something similar happened to her. Ectoplasm was actually coming out of her eye, and she said that a bloke switched the light on, and she said this is in her early days of doing it. She said she wouldn't let it happen now. She didn't know this guy very well. He switched on the lights, and the ectoplasm whipped back into her eye somehow, and caused her a whiplash on her face, and caused an injury there for quite a time. Now, I'd gone to that place, and I'd met a lady there that I've been in a psychic developing circle a few times, and I thought, oh, that's a familiar face, I'll chat to her. I said, well, what have you seen in your experience? Have you been to anything like this before? She goes, oh yeah, I've been to something like this before, but not at this place. She said, I went to a seance, and the lights were on, because some people said that you can actually do this sort of phenomenon with the lights on. And she said that she was sitting around this table, there's only about 5 of them there, and the medium was sitting there, and out of his stomach came a hand, literally in the daylight. And it was a black hand, and it wrapped on the table to show that it was physically solid, and then it proceeded to stretch out and go and shake hands with everyone that's sitting around the table, and then went back into the guy's stomach again. I thought, oh my God, I find it hard to stomach. But so there is, that was her account, and she just told me, because I asked her, she wasn't writing books about it or anything like that. So it's an interesting thing that, again, you've got to be aware of these things, that there are genuine mediums, but there's also fake. You can't really allow yourself to be, hopefully not be taken in, and hopefully my pointers have given you ideas of maybe things to look out for as well. Now, I don't want to end this on a negative one, and I'll tell you something really clever that I thought was extraordinarily good example of mediumship. There's a guy called Ross Bartlett. Anyone heard of him? Young medium, lives in Southampton. He's only about 23, 24, and I was told that there's only like 1 every 300,000 do you get this kind of person. That he's really, really good at mediumship. It reminded me of a guy that I saw many years ago called Gordon Higginson, who died in about 1990. This lady recognises that name as well. He was an extraordinary medium who used to get out people's phone numbers, door numbers, things like that. I mean, Gordon Higginson, I was about 23 myself when I saw him, and he died a few years later, but he actually gave out evidence to this chap that was sitting in the front. He goes, you, sir, he said, before you came out here tonight, says you changed your coat. He said, the coat you got on now is not the coat that you're wearing when you came out. He says, you decided when you got in your car that you didn't like the coat you was wearing, you got out of your car, you went back into the room, you threw your coat on the bed, went to the wardrobe, got out the coat that you've now got on, and came here tonight. He goes, yeah, that's exactly right. And then he said, my helpers, in other words, his spirit guides or whatever you want to call them, have gone down to the multi-storey car park at the bottom of the building here, and they've just come, and then now just come back and told me what car you've got. You've got a red sports car with the registration plate PYE something something, because he couldn't quite see it all, 237 or something like that. And this bloke's going, oh my God, you know. So everyone was just clapping. How could he get that information? And again, this was 1989, no internet, nothing like that. This guy was not known to him as far as I was aware. And again, I remember telling this to a guy that I worked with. I told him this astounding story, and he said, oh, it's fake. I said, well, how do they do it then? He goes, well, I don't know. They're always keen to tell you it's fake, but they have no idea how it's done. But this chap, Ross Barley, is very similar. And my girlfriend had seen him maybe a month or two earlier down in Weymouth where he was demonstrating. And her daughter's called Emily, and she worked in Bristol at the time for Tesco's. And so he came to her, and she's sitting in the front, and he said, I'd like to come to you, madam. I've got so-and-so here, I can't remember the name of the spirit that he brought through. And he said, I'm being told about Emily, you know Emily? And she goes, yeah, that's right. And she goes, I'm being told she works in Bristol. And she goes, yeah, that's right. And she goes, I'm being shown a supermarket here. And he goes, again, it qualified the thing that she worked at Tesco's. And so she said, we've got to go and see this guy. So a friend of mine lives in Watford, and I said, you've got to get this guy up to Watford sometime, if you can. And so another friend of his basically booked this Ross Bartley to appear, and they got him to appear at a place called Ruislip. So we went along. Of course, we got there late, because that's how it happens. We arrived there late, and there's 4 buildings. They all looked exactly the same. We wasn't sure which building to go in, so we had to go through every single building before we finally found it, so it made it even later. So we get there, and there's a guy in the door, and the demonstration started. And it's a small room like this, and we thought, oh shit, it started, what do we do? And the guy at the door with a white shirt, the guy that takes the money, said, oh, go and sit down at the front there, I'll get the money off you later. So we said, thank you. So we made our way, and we was ushered to 2 chairs. They said, spare chairs here. So we sat down there, and we happened to be sitting where Andy is roughly, to the side of the medium. Now when we got there, the medium was talking to another chap over here, blah, 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 and then at the end, he said, I'd like to come to this gentleman over here, and then suddenly looked at me, and I thought, oh my God, I've arrived late, but I'm getting the next message. I felt really guilty. So quickly started recording it, and he said, I've got Evie here. I went, sorry, Evie? I don't know an Evie. He goes, Evie, who was married to Edward. And I said, I don't know an Edward. And he says, well, she definitely knows you. And I thought, nah, it must be the person behind me who's got this wrong, surely. And he goes, well, look, your brother Phil goes to her grave and takes pictures. And I've got a brother Phil, and he does take pictures of family members' graves. So I thought, oh my God, that rings true. But I couldn't understand who Evie was. And he said, Evie is telling me about Morgan. Now Morgan is my daughter. And I thought, oh my God. And she said, she likes children, that's why she's dropped in on your daughter as she's been grown up to keep an eye on her. And he told other things, but then he sort of went, there was a pause, and he goes, right, okay. And there's a distinct sort of, should I say this? I'm not sure if I'm getting this right or not. He says, okay, I'll go for this, but I don't know if it's right. He said, that man over there by the door in the white shirt. I said, yeah. He says, do you see him? I went, yeah. He said, well, his name is Chris Hayes. I went, now, I didn't know this guy on the door, but that name meant something to me. And he said, Evie is saying that Morgan also is connected to a Chris Hayes. And I said, yeah, that's absolutely right. My daughter Morgan, now 21, has been going out with this guy called Chris Hayes. He happened to have the same name as the guy at the door. And I thought, what is the chances of that happening? It defies odds, really, doesn't it? And the fact is that he wasn't even looking at me when he was giving these messages. He was looking up there. So all these people say, oh, they're cold language, body reading and things like that. He wasn't even looking at me. And yet he connected my daughter Morgan, and he got the name Chris Hayes, he got my brother Phil, he said my other 2 brothers, which aren't on the internet, interestingly, Simon and Russell, those names also came through. He also said my mum's name, he also said my granddad's name was Welsh. I thought, how the hell can he get that unless he's communicating with something that's departed? But I still couldn't understand who Evie was. And anyway, after the reading, I went home and I told my mum, because she was still with us at that point, I said, who's Evie? And I played her the recording, and she said, I don't know who Evie is. So a few days later, she was talking to my dad's sister on the phone, who lives down in Southampton, and she said, oh, I know who Evie is, that's your Auntie Doris. What do you mean, Auntie Doris? And it turned out that my Auntie Doris, as we grew up with Auntie Doris, she always had 2 fingers missing off each hand. I never understood why as a kid. Obviously later on she's obviously having arthritis problems. They used to cut her fingers off, but as a kid I used to think that she just like having her fingers removed, you know. Because she'd always show me another finger's gone from Auntie Doris this week, you know. But I said to her, you know, apparently her first name was Evie or Evelyn, but she never liked that name. So she took her middle name of Doris, and everyone grew up thinking that she was called Doris for the rest of her life. And of course, then it all made sense. Auntie Doris was married to Uncle Ted, Edward, which was the thing. So it shows that this guy was spot on with everything he said, and there was no mind reading because I didn't even know those particular facts about Evie or Edward at the time, you see. So again, you can't say that whole body language reading or anything like that. It just defies the logical odds of people see that, you see. Right, I think I'm drawing to a close here. So, there's one last thing I'll mention. A guy to me said once, do ghosts come in all shapes and sizes? And I said, why do you ask that then? He said, well, back in the 1960s and 70s, I worked at this research establishment, and he said we were developing something like silicon chip. He said, that's what you'd call it today, but we didn't call it that back then, but it was the precursor to the silicon chip. And I was a young kind of technician working away at things. And one day, I was in a room, and it was an old kind of manor house building. He was on one side of the room at his desk with a lamp and a magnifying glass and circuitry and all that kind of stuff, and his friend was on the other side of the room. And he said, suddenly, as they were walking away, the room lit up blue. And they thought, well, what's that? And they both looked round to see, coming down the middle of the room, something about the size of a shoebox, the shape of a shoebox, and it was glowing blue, hovering, floating down the central aisle of this room. And they watched it in amazement, and it went out the doorway and turned right, went down the corridors, floating, and they were absolutely gobsmacked. So he said that we went and found our supervisor, and they went, you're not going to believe what we see. And they said, we've seen this blue box floating through us, blah, 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 blah. And he goes, come with me. He said, what? So he took him down to this basement room. There's an old boy who'd been working in this place for years and years and years. He said, tell Fred here what you've just seen. He said, well, we've seen this blue glowing box floating down the room. And this old boy who'd been there years and years said, yeah, I've seen it too, many a time in this building. And whatever it was coming into this building regularly. And because it was a research place, I wasn't going to say it was a ghost because it didn't kind of fit the category of ghosts as I've been describing tonight. It seemed to be more something, perhaps alien technology, I wonder. Now, there's a lady I know called Hilary Porter. She works for this UFO thing called Beams Investigations in Hampshire. And she started something similar quite a few years ago, back in the 1980s. She was a technical illustrator, and she used to work for Marconi Defence Systems, and they're to do with sort of MOD contracts and things like satellites, underwater systems, missiles, that kind of thing, radar, etc., etc. And she was a technical illustrator. And again, they worked in a great big manor house somewhere in Hampshire. And she said that on a night shift once, the security guy was going around checking all the rooms as he does on his shift. And he could see, again, a blue light coming from this room. The door was open. He thought, what's down there? So he went in and looked into this room, and there in this room was this man who appeared to have something like a motorbike on it. And he was emanating this blue light, and he was thumbing through this filing cabinet. And he looked round, and he saw this security guard looking at him, and then he just vanished. And this poor security guard dropped his torch and ran away. And apparently he was so distraught by it, he had to be literally taken into some sort of mental care because he just couldn't get over it. The next day, the whole place was filled with security people, MOD police, high chiefs of security, everything like that, coming down from London. And this lady, Hilary Porter, because she worked there, she happened to be in the next room and overheard a conversation through a doorway. And she could hear the boss of her establishment talking to the head of MI5 or whoever it was, saying, the trouble is, these things come in all the time. There's no way we can stop them. So whatever it is they're infiltrating MOD places, research establishments. Maybe it's aliens, maybe it's Russians. I don't know. There's some strange phenomena going on. Now, quickly, I just forgot to mention this earlier. I talked about doorways and spirit cabinets and things like that, and I was trying to explain to this gentleman the reason that I believe that spirit cabinets are square and why we see ghosts in doorways. Lots of people seen ghosts in doorways or windows, and it kind of built up a pattern after a while. My mum said that she saw her father standing in the doorway, and I kept thinking, why are these spirits always standing in doorways? It's a very interesting thing. And many years ago I saw this TV documentary where they're investigating a haunted house in Scotland, And this guy said that he was sitting at his computer one time, he felt a presence watching him, a real strong presence watching him, and he said it simply come from the doorway behind him. So they called in this sort of psychic team with all their little gadgets and stuff like that, and they were going around measuring electromagnetic energy and all that kind of stuff that supposedly ghosts are associated with. But they particularly found it around this doorway, and they said there's a lot of electromagnetic radiation, or whatever you want to call it, coming from this doorway. And that got me thinking. I thought, here we go again, doorways again. And then when I was talking to a physical medium, and he's showing me his toilet tent, trance cabinet, whatever you want to call it, I said, why do you have this box? What's the idea of it? He said, well, it builds up energy within it. The spirit has to build up energy, then it manifests and it can come out of this cabinet. And I mentioned the cupboard in the doorway where the Native American Indian came out as well, you see. And I believe that what it is, it's only a hypothesis, I can't prove it, I'm not a scientist, that in the same way that if you think of a TV, now before we had these plasma TVs and things like that, we used to have these great big TVs, didn't we? And they used to have great big backs to them. And it used to be that they'd fire electrons to the screen through this tube, and it hit the screen from inside and then bounce across from one end of the screen to the other. And it'd do that 50 times a second, and then it'd build up a picture within the TV screen. Now, if you didn't have an edge of a TV screen there and an edge of a TV screen here or here, that electron would just fly off into space. You'd never see anything. So it had to have a framework around it to build up an image, okay? And in the same way that when you're making a cake, say, you're making a mixture that has then got to be changed its state from a liquid to a solid form. And so what you do, you put it in an oven, you shut the oven door, so you have it in a framework, so the heat energy will stay within that thing and build it up and change the state of that cake mixture. If you open the oven door, that heat escapes and it won't change. I believe that something like doorways are used as in a similar pattern, that somehow they can hold the energy in some way that we don't yet understand. And this is how they build their energy, bouncing it backwards and forwards or something to build up a temporary appearance. Maybe they can manifest as a spirit in a sort of short wave form, or they do it in a longer sense of coming out through the ectoplasm of a certain medium. It all depends on certain factors, the medium's ability and what skills they've got as well. Anyway, I've been speaking for long enough. I'll just say to this, I've been talking about spirits of the past and possibly spirits of the future, but what I'll say is I can guarantee that we'll all be ghosts of tomorrow. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. Questions now? Okay. I've got 5 minutes to take questions from anybody, and I know there's a few people who've got questions. Oh, a couple, gentlemen at the back first of all.
I've got two of it really quickly.
Yeah.
Inside, outside, or doesn't it matter? Like, are these phenomenon, experienced externally, like in the case of two people seeing the same thing? Is that a regular thing, or is it?
Are you saying ghosts can they be seen inside buildings or outside buildings?
No, inside people's minds or outside in the material world. While I was thinking about that, I was thinking, well, maybe everything's an internal experience anyway.
Well, I mean, if you go into the world of quantum physics, they will say that everything's a complete illusion anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And the thing is, we're trying to measure this quantum world with devices and things like that, but what science is failing to realise is that these measuring devices are also part of this quantum world, so they don't tell the true tale of what's going on anyway, because it's like a cartoon trying to see itself as a cartoon, it's like a pencil within a pencil within a pencil, it's like a world within a world. You just don't know what's real after a while. But the fact is, if you want to talk about external things, people have allegedly taken photographs of ghosts and things. The fact that 2 people saw that lady sitting on the roof of the church, they're seeing something perhaps objective. But whether maybe that the spirit can constrain it so that 2 people can see it in their own mind, but it's not there to be seen by everybody, maybe you have to be psychic enough to see these things, because I don't really see ghosts, but I feel their presences, and it just depends on maybe the psychic makeup of the individual, what they might experience, you see. It could be that in 5 years' time I might see something, I just don't know, okay?
The second question was the experiencer of these phenomena. Do you think that the state while they experience it is important to the fact that they're open to it? You mentioned like the subconscious being open to it, as in when we're dreaming and so on.
Yeah.
You mentioned 3 cases where there was possible high anxiety, like a soldier trying to get some sleep, a woman who'd lost her child, and a doctor working long hours in a hospital. But also a very peaceful thing where somebody was admiring the beauty of nature as well. And I'm wondering if things that connect all those experiences are that somehow the rational mind is entertained eliminated, so the subconscious can be a bit more open to what's already there?
Well, if we talk about hypnosis, where people are typically relaxed and they're put in a trance, and suggestions are given to them while they're in a trance. But I've also read that you don't have to be in a trance as such under a relaxed state. You can also be given suggestions in a very stressed out state. Maybe people in battle are directed to do certain things they wouldn't normally do, simply because they're in a stressed out state and their mind doesn't know how to judge things, it does it without thinking. So I think each sort of case has to be taken on a case-by-case basis to really understand what's going on. But I do tend to think generally that most of the time, if you're in a relaxed state, your mind is not guarding against, or the ego is not kind of judging things as such, that you're perhaps in a relaxed state, you'll see things better. And this is why I think I may have seen it ghosts when I was more half asleep, and I tend to hear voices, and I'm sure a lot of people here have heard voices, or you tend to feel that you've got a message coming through when you're half asleep. And so I think that generally the ballpark figure is that we probably would experience these things more if we're not focusing on the outside world enough. And certainly in psychic developing circles, part of the key to communicating with the spirit world is to go into a meditative state, and that's where you hear things. I mean, I remember one of the first things that surprised me, I had to go into a meditative state and I had to do a reading on the man in front of me. And I didn't know this guy very well, but he ran in a circle, he was an elderly chap, and I got this voice just appear in a meditative state, which I wouldn't have normally heard had I been consciously focused. But I was in a meditative state and I wasn't really sure if I had any power or not, but this voice in a very Cockney accent said, "Tell him about the waterworks." And I thought, oh gosh, I can't say that to that chap. But I said, I think you've got a medical condition you have to see the doctor about. And he said, yes, I do, but I didn't want to say it in public, and that's what mediums say, they wrap up the message a bit. But I was young and experienced there, I didn't want to sort of say that sort of thing. But I would perhaps, if I was doing that now, I'd wrap it up in a way that he would personally understand. Now, somebody else had a question. Oh, lady here, I'm sorry, I'm going to come to you, then I'll come to you.
Very quickly,
yeah, very quickly,
if that's right.
Questions, yeah.
You talking about a voice that came out of somebody, it wasn't their own voice. I had a really bad experience up on the River Kwai, and I've had a couple of things before, and I say something that actually whatever's there goes, but I couldn't speak because this thing was crushing the life out of me, and then a voice came out of me, and it was a man's voice, like a man's voice. It's very deep, and it said the words that I would normally say, and the room all cleared. So I do believe that there are certain times that somebody steps in for us. Where that comes from, I don't know, but it's, you know, that it's some form of divine power that actually enables us to clear whatever negativity might be there, or whatever might be there.
Could be a spirit guide as well.
But it's a different voice, and it was amazing because I couldn't get anything out. This voice came out, and it was very deep, very. That's what you said. It's very strong. There's a force with it.
Yeah.
So it's yeah.
Takes charge, sort of thing.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you. And this gentleman here, you have a question.
Yeah, what's your take on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Fairies at the bottom of the garden?
Sorry, the what?
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Fairies at the bottom of his garden.
Oh, we're talking about the Cotley Fairies. Yeah, the Cotley Fairies, for those that don't know, when I think it was around the First World War, two girls up in Yorkshire claimed to have seen fairies, Elsie and I forget the other girl's name. They made a film called Fairy Tale in the mid-90s about it. They took pictures of alleged fairies on sort of plate cameras that they were at the time. They later proved to be fake because they were long exposures, probably a minute or two, and the streams behind them in the pictures were actually blurry. In other words, show that as they exposed it for a minute, the stream carried on running. And as I think it was James Randi pointed out, that if you've got a fairy here with its fluttering wings, surely the fairy wings should be blurry as well. And I do remember seeing them on Nationwide back in the 70s, thinking these look like cardboard cutouts and things. And it turned out that they'd actually cut these pictures out of a magazine or traced them or something like that. But they still maintained they did see fairies, but they thought that no one would believe them. So they faked the pictures to try and impress it. But she says, as young children, the whole story ran away with itself and they didn't know what to say. And of course, Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes author, was involved in that, and they didn't want to kind of admit to faking those pictures, so they just kind of kept stum about it for many, many years. And eventually one of them died, and when one died, the other one kind of broke that silence and said, yes, we did fake them. But she always maintained that one of those pictures was genuine, but I don't know which one. Now this lady's got a question.
I thought you might be interested. Some years ago, back in the 70s, a friend and I swapped houses. The reason being she had 4 children who kept breaking all her crockery. Every morning when she came downstairs, there was crockery all over the floor. And she got so fed up with it. I loved her house and she loved mine, so we swapped houses with some cash sort of changing hands. And then it started happening to me. My kids were in their teens, and I thought, this can't be. And then I saw this lady in what I could only describe as a Puritan dress.
Mm-hmm.
Had no idea who she was. This was about a 500-year-old farmhouse, by the way. And I couldn't think who she was. So I just said, I don't know what your name is, but I'm going to call you Mary. Now listen, Mary, if you don't stop messing about, I'll have you exercise. If you want to stay here and live with us, that's fine. But just stop mucking about. And I never had any problem from that day onwards. Now, seriously, I promise you this is true. About 3 years later, we decided to dig up the floor of the cellar because it was very low. We found a body.
Wow.
And it was a female. And we had it reinterred, obviously, you know. I thought that was interesting.
Interesting indeed. Yeah, thank you very much.
We've got to stop there.
Okay,
I'm really
we'll stop
sorry.
there.
Before I thank Neil properly, before you go, if you snuck in late, didn't pay, if you could just see Helen, that'd be lovely. Support the cause. If you want to stack up a few chairs before you go, that'd be really helpful. A few of us go over for a drink at the Potter's Arms. So if anybody wants to come and join us, it gets a bit noisy there, but we'll go there. But I thought that was a really fascinating evening, and I think you will agree too. So please, a massive hand for Neil.
The information where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.